All right. How's it going, everybody? Chuck Holton here. And you ever have one of those days where you just would really like to shut everything off and go outside and not think about work at all? No, not just work, not think about anything at all. Just go outside and stare at the sky. Maybe lay on your back under a tree. Because if you don't, you're probably going to go set somebody on fire. That's uh that's how I kind of feel today. It's been one of those days, working to try to get stuff done that should be easy, should take 5 minutes, and it takes like 2 hours. And I mean, don't you just hate that? Like things that should be so simple. Buying a plane ticket. How hard is buying a plane ticket? I buy plane tickets every week. But trying to buy a plane ticket today through Arabian Air, and they had me inventing new curse words in Arabic. That's how just insane it made me. It was just such a waste of time. Finally got it done. And so, I feel a little bit better. I got one thing accomplished today. Didn't get any of the editing done that I needed to do. I've got to leave tomorrow and head to the city. I'm gonna go out to the place I'm going to talk to you about today, tomorrow. So I don't know how long uh, I'll have to be out there, but I've got to leave Thursday morning to fly to Washington, D.C. and go to a funeral. And then on, what's that, Friday? Then on Friday afternoon, Friday night, the funeral's on Friday. Friday night, I leave and go to Israel for 10 days or so. And so I'm basically not going to get to see my home again here for several weeks at least. And then, we're off to the races because then we've got our trip to Iwo Jima. And that's going to be a couple of weeks long. We are going to make a documentary, a little short documentary about. So I'll just tell you this right off the bat. If you can fast forward that, if you're watching this later, if you don't want to hear about our little documentary, but it's a friend of mine somehow found a K-bar knife, a Marine Corps combat knife that was sticking in the bones of a Japanese soldier on the island of Tinian. Tinian is the island that they made into a giant air base during World War II, and that's where the Enola Gay took off from to go bomb Hiroshima. So it's, historic place. And they had to it was a heck of a battle to take Tinian. And so it's the 80th anniversary of the battle this year. A friend of mine found a K-bar knife sticking in the bones of a Japanese soldier on the island. And the knife had carved into it the initials of the guy who owned it. And somehow, by searching through 20,000 military records of people that were on the island, I don't know how he did it. He found the family of the guy who owned the knife. And we're going to try to give it back to them on the 80th anniversary on the island of Tinian in the Pacific. And we're going to make a cool little story out of it if we can work it out. This family lives in Wisconsin. We've got to raise the money to get them get them to Tinian. Obviously, it's not easy or cheap to fly somebody that far. So we're going to see if we can work it out. But if we can get that done, it's going to be a really awesome story. So let's talk about what is happening with the migrant crisis. Here in Panama, it's all over the local news now that there are migrants going back the way they came from the United States. They're moving back now because they can't get into the US. Imagine that. All it took was the will to close the border, and the border's closed. Just like that. Now, we've been hearing for the last 4 years that President Biden's been saying, if only the Congress would give me this bill, if only the Senate would give me more power, if only the, if only. We're doing a great job. That Muppet Karine Jean-Pierre kept saying, we're doing a great job along the border. We're, you know, we're cracking down. It's going to be, we're reducing the flow. And when President Trump came into office, President Trump said, close the border. Boom, it's closed. That's it. Game over. The number of people coming across the border into the United States now is somewhere in the dozens every day, rather than 5,000 or more in the every day, up to I think 14 or 15,000 in a day is what we had. And it's just so wonderful to see. I've been reporting on the migration crisis since the Obama administration, no, before that, probably 2003, something like that. I've been talking about migration, going down to the U.S. southern border, embedding with U.S. National Guard troops that were down there on listing posts, observation posts. So I've been doing this for a long time. And now, as of January 20th, boom, it's done. It's over. I was talking to my friend Todd Bensman last night. He's a former intelligence guy for the Texas Rangers, if you didn't know that. Now he's a senior fellow at the Center for Immigration Studies, and it's been his only beat for the last 4 years, the immigration crisis. He's written 2 books about it, very well received. He's made it his whole life. And I was talking to him yesterday, and he's like, I feel lost. There's like, it's over. I don't know what to do now. Like, what do it's like as a war correspondent, the way I would feel if all the wars stopped around the world. Oh, please, God, let that happen. I'd love to be out of this job, just knowing that all the wars had ended. But a lot of the journalists that I know that have been reporting on the migration crisis for all this time, Oscar Blue Ramirez and many others, are saying the same thing, like, gosh, what do we do now? Well, it looks like we're not quite out of a job yet, because now the migration crisis is just turning around and going back the other direction. And we're like, what? This has been hitting the news all over in Panama. And I wrote an article about it and put that article up over at chuckholton.com. You can go there and see that yourself if you like. I think it's a really great article. And it's taken from local media and other sources, sort of aggregated stuff. But what's happening is that some portion of the migrants who were shut out and weren't able to get into the United States have been making their way back here, because they're deciding, well, if I can't get into the US, I might as well just go back home or find somewhere else to go. And there's that choke point called the Darien Gap between Panama and Colombia. It's a very inhospitable jungle. No roads through there yet. Probably never will be. There's a swamp the size of Delaware. There's rivers, mountains, cliffs, lots and lots of bugs and animals that everything in there wants to bite you, sting you, or eat you. Hey, thank you very much, GJ. Appreciate that. And I saw somebody else, PC. Thank you. We'll use whatever you're given here and put it toward the plane tickets for this family in Wisconsin to get them over to Tinian so we can give them their knife back. I guess their grandfather, they have a photograph of him with that knife, the Marine Corps combat knife, and he had also scratched the same initials in all of his other tools. So we were able to confirm that the knife actually belonged to him. Pretty awesome, actually. 80 years later, they're getting the knife back. It's pretty awesome. So this, one of the things that we've been seeing here in Panama is that as soon as Trump took office, the flow through the Darien Gap all but stopped. Just maybe 10, 15 people a day coming through there now. It was 5,000 a day. Part of that is because the United States immediately partnered with Panama to agree to deport anybody who came into Panama illegally. They don't get to continue on to the United States. They put them on an airplane and they send them right back to the country they came from. And if they don't like that plan, then thank you, KP. Then the Panamanian government sends them down to a camp in the Darien Gap that they built specifically for all the migrants that were coming through on their way to the US, which now is empty. They're sending these migrants, if they don't want to get deported back home, they just stick them in that camp and say, okay, you can stay here the rest of your life in the Darien Gap. You talk about a fate worse than death. It's a, camp on the side of the road, no air conditioning, mud, bugs the size of your face. It's not a friendly place, not a nice place to live. It was paid for by U.S. tax dollars in part, and in part by the funding of UN agencies like the OIM, Organization for Immigration and Migration. And it was paid for in part by Panama as well. Panama at some point was, they said, spending $6 million a week on food for all the migrants. Now they don't have to do that anymore. Now, let me go back up a little bit and just explain to you how it was working so that you can understand what a big difference it is now. When I started reporting on the migration crisis in Panama, down in the Darien Gap, was about 2012 or so. And it was more drugs then than it was people. Back then, 30 or 40 people a month coming through there was a big deal. Big deal. I went down in 2012. I remember very specifically because it was the day my dad died. I was down there in the jungle, embedded with the Center Front, the border police here in Panama, making a documentary about them, and got a call from my mom in a place where there wasn't any cell phone service, which is a miracle. And I answered, my phone rang, and I went, "What?" And I answered the phone. And my mom said, the first thing she said, "My friend and I were just on our knees praying that this call would go through." I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "Your father just passed away suddenly." And so I said, "I'll be right there." And I hung up, went to the commander of the Center Front guys and said, "Comandante, I'm really sorry, but I've got to go. My father just passed away." I had some tears in my eyes, and he looked at one of his lieutenants and said, "Get this guy on the next flight to the United States." Well, at that time, it was about a 3-hour drive to the airport. We made it in an hour and a half. I thought we were going to have a double funeral by the time. I mean, I didn't think I was going to make it. He was driving like crazy to get us there, but he got me there. I got on a flight. Thank you, Carla Joe. And I made it home that evening. Dirty, nasty, hadn't showered in 2 days, muddy, sweaty, smelled terrible, sitting in first class because my company was nice enough to get me a first class ticket. It was a surreal moment, but I remember very vividly. It was August 16th, 2012 when that happened. So I was reporting down there since then. By 2017, it was Cuba, mostly Cubans, some Colombians, Venezuelans, mostly Cubans and some Haitians, I guess, were coming through at that time. And at that point, it was up to maybe 130, 150, 160 a month. That was huge. I mean, it was like unbelievable. That was like a year's worth from before. Well, then it just kept going up and kept going up and kept going up. And by the time Joe Biden threw open the floodgates when he took office in 2021, the numbers just skyrocketed. And there was, of course, leftovers of the sickness from that time period. So that had made the numbers go down. At that time, Panama had proven that they could close the Darien Gap if they wanted to, because when the sickness hit in 2020, 2021, Panama locked everything down, everything just locked down. And they closed the airports, closed the borders, everything, locked everybody in their homes. It was house arrest, terrible. Panama had one of the worst lockdowns of any place in the world. And they said, oh, it'll just be 15 days, no big deal. And it ended up staying that way for 10 and a half months. Months. Now, I was stuck here for about 11 weeks, and then we finally called the embassy and said, get us out. We can't do this. And they laid on a emergency humanitarian flight back to the States and got us back to the land of the free and the home of the brave. And in West Virginia, you wouldn't have known there was a sickness because everybody just treated it like it the actual sickness it was. And here in Panama, what they said was, if you come during that time, if you come into Panama illegally through the Darien Gap, you're going to stay in the Darien Gap in a camp out in the jungle until this sickness is over, as long as that takes. And they were there for about a year. There were babies born in the mud in that camp. It was terrible. It was finally they started rioting, literally rioting and burning stuff down because they didn't want to stay there anymore. I can't blame them there. And since, as soon as they made the just said everybody has to stay there until the sickness is over, everybody quit coming because nobody wanted to live there. How about that? So I've been saying ever since then that all Panama has to do if they really want to close the Darien Gap is just say that again. Just say, if you come into our country illegally, we got this camp down in the Darien Gap, you're gonna live in that camp for at least 12 months. And then we'll think about letting you go. And oh, by the way, if you bring a child through, because so many people brought little babies and little ones through there, I mean, that's the worst kind of neglect. So Panama should have said, if you bring a child through there, that is child abuse. You will be arrested and you will go to jail for 5 years. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. You're going to jail. That would have ended it. But they didn't do that. They made a lot of fuss about, oh, this is such a bad, terrible thing. Oh, gosh, U.S., we need help, But they didn't stop it under the previous president. Varela was his name. And I was having this conversation with my daughter, Amy, yesterday about this because she's writing a paper about it for some class she's got at college. And she said, well, Dad, if now they've been able to stop it, because basically what they've done is say, if you come in, we're going to deport you immediately, or you're going to stay in the Darien Gap forever until you decide to get deported. And that stopped it. And she said, well, why didn't they just do that before? And I said, because the Biden administration wouldn't let them. You see, Alejandro Mayorkas, the Secretary of State, came down here, and I'm sorry, Secretary of Homeland Security came down here several times. And his stated purpose when he came here during the Biden administration was not to stop the migration through the Darien Gap. By his own admission, as he would give speeches about this, his intent coming down here was to make the traverse through the Darien Gap, which was at one point killing about 10% of everyone who tried it. 10 out of every 100 people wouldn't come out again on the other side. They had 30 or 40 babies every year that would either walk out on their own or get carried out by somebody who didn't know who they were because their parent died of exposure in the gap. And they found the baby laying there on the ground or whatever. They picked it up and they carried it out and said, "This isn't my baby. I don't know whose it is." Baby didn't have any documents. Baby couldn't speak yet, couldn't tell you its name. They didn't know what these babies' names were. They didn't know what country they were from. They didn't know whose parents they had or anything. They were just lost children. And Panama doesn't have a foster care system. I mean, Panama's foster care system for Panamanians is they find the next closest family member and say, take care of it. That's it. It's your responsibility. If you're the aunt, the uncle, the grandma, whatever, if you're the next closest kin to a person who dies. So yeah, that when they started getting these kids in here and they didn't have any idea where they should be or what country they were from or what their names were, they would stick them in a hotel or a hospital or something for several months and put ads in the paper and try to put out the word, hey, help us figure out whose kids these are. And if nobody came forward, they would just name them Juan and put them in school. They don't have a system here for kids like that. So if there's no family, there is one, as far as I know, one orphanage in Panama that's run by some friends of ours. And that's it. That's all they have. They don't even have a. Come on back. Come on back. Hang on. Okay, there we go. We're back, folks. Sorry. Yeah, the connection was bad because I forgot that I was actually connected to a VPN in the United Arab Emirates because that's what it took to buy those stupid plane tickets. Sorry about that. So we ought to have a better connection now. Anyway, so just imagine how crazy it is that so my daughter was asking me if they were able to close the Darien Gap and stop the people from coming through illegally by just announcing that they had to get deported or stay in this camp in the Darien. Why didn't they do that 4 years ago? And I said, because Alejandro Mayorkas did not want the Darien Gap to be closed. We are starting to learn, starting to understand even more just how much the Biden administration actually wanted this irregular migration. They wanted it. They planned on it. We've been saying this all along, but I mean, the proof is in the pudding now. I mean, we have so much proof. All this time we were getting this runaround from the Biden administration that, oh gosh, we're doing all we can. We can't help it. Oh, we're making progress. No, they weren't. They were intentionally cranking it up to 11 on the illegal immigration. During the election cycle, Kamala Harris kept getting asked about illegal immigration, and she kept saying, well, it's the fault of the Senate. If the Senate would pass this bill, if this bill had not been blocked by Senate Republicans that allowed 1.8 million migrants a year into the United States, and then we would crack down on it and slow it down a little bit. That was her idea. That was what Kamala Harris's big plan was. She was trying to blame it on Senate Republicans. Well, guess what? Here we are, and it's closed. It's done. Game over. When I was in Tijuana a couple weeks ago, I talked to a Mexican lady who really, really, really wanted to get across the border into the United States. It was not, it was very, very difficult to do, obviously. She paid the cartel, she told me, $12,000 just to walk across the border out in a very remote area where they were letting them cross. I think they helped her over the fence. And she said she didn't get across the fence 5 minutes, and the Border Patrol picked her up, brought her back to the gate, and sent her back to Mexico. She lost her $12,000. So when stories like that start coming out, and we start to understand that the Biden administration and Alejandro Mayorkas wanted this irregular migration, and they talked at length all the time about, pointed out rightly so, how dangerous this trek was, and that we have to do things to make it safer and faster and less expensive so that they're not having to pay off the cartels to get to the United States. That was all they worked on. Alejandro Mayorkas set up centers all across Latin America, in Guatemala and Colombia and everywhere, where migrants could go and get their appointment done at that center for their asylum claim. I put those in scare quotes because, as you've heard me say many times, that they had no claim of asylum. They were all economic migrants, everyone. And they set up these centers to do their preliminary asylum hearing, give them, sort of a temporary status in the United States, put them on an airplane and fly them into the heartland of America so that they didn't show up in the numbers of people getting picked up by Border Patrol along the border. And then the Biden administration tried to claim that the numbers of irregular crossings was going down. They're trying to say, yes, we've done a great job. Look, the number of crossings is going down along the border. The number of illegals getting picked up by Border Patrol is going down. Yeah, it's going down because you're flying them in directly from Latin America, from Nicaragua and Guatemala and Colombia. You're flying them in. When Mayorkas came to Panama, he did the same thing. He said, we've got to make it less expensive, safer, and faster for these people to get through the Darien Gap, because 10% of the people that go in don't come out again. That's terrible. All these people are dying. We got to fix this. Yeah, the way to fix it would be to close it. Just close it. All it took was the will to close it, and it's closed. Chris asks, do the Panamanian people know what's happening? They didn't until we started putting the word out. Oscar Blue Ramirez was instrumental in that because he's a Spanish-speaking journalist, and he was doing Spanish language TikToks, which is how most people here get their news anymore, and was putting out the word, showing what was going on down there. President Varela of Panama was trying to hide it by making those migrants move through Panama as fast as possible. So when they got picked up coming across the Darien Gap, when they got into Panama, they put them in a camp down there for a couple days, and then they would put them on buses and they would send them right to the Costa Rican border. Bypass Panama City, bypass everything. Don't stop, drive all the way overnight to the Costa Rican border and drop them off. And then the migration officials from Panama would say, now, it's illegal for you to cross into Costa Rica, but you can't stay here. So it's illegal for you to cross, but you're not allowed to stay here anymore. So they would cross illegally into Costa Rica, and they'd get picked up by Costa Rican authorities. They would put them on a bus. They would drive them through Costa Rica, drop them off at the Nicaraguan border. The Nicaraguans would pick them up, put them on a bus, drive them north to Guatemala, drop them off again. and so on and so forth, all the way up to the United States border. It was a giant conga line, a huge pipeline of people. And it was making politicians and cartels throughout Latin America millions, if not billions of dollars. One of the reasons that the Colombians even allowed them to go into Panama was that Colombian politicians were being paid off and were making a lot of money off of all of these migrants. But it wasn't just them. I mean, so we've talked about this question a lot. But what is a smuggler? The smuggler is who's paying for the buses, Brandy? The migrants themselves had to pay $40 each for the bus rides, 8-hour bus ride to the Costa Rican border. I think it was subsidized in part by Panama. I don't know that for sure. But I mean, what is a smuggler? Is it some nefarious, shady character that's, hiding in the shadows and carrying these people where they need to go? Well, sometimes, but sometimes it's the taxi driver who picks the migrants up and takes them to their next stop. Sometimes it's the bus driver who picks them up and takes them to the next stop. Sometimes it's the boat captain who picks them up and takes them across a body of water. Sometimes it's the hotel operator that crams 18 of them into a hotel room, et cetera, et cetera. Many times, in many cases, the smuggler was the government. The smuggler was the Panamanian government that arranged for all of this to take place. The smuggler was the American government that sent taxpayer dollars down. When I was in Cúcuta, Colombia this week, this last week, I went to the border. There used to be a tent right on the Venezuelan Colombian border, right at the end of the bridge where people crossed into Colombia, leaving Venezuela. And it was a UN funded tent where these people could come in, they could register with the OIM, and they would get given a debit card with money on it that they could use to help themselves get up further north, up to the Darien Gap and beyond. When they got to the Guatemala-Mexican border, there was another OIM tent that brought them in and gave them another debit card. And that money that was on those debit cards was being funded by the United States. No ifs, ands, or buts. The U.S. was paying for it. Now, what we see is that whole apparatus of smuggling turning around and going the other direction. For the last couple of months, the people who were making millions of dollars a year on all the migration coming through Latin America were out of work. They were really suffering, poor guys. They were hurting. And they weren't making money anymore because there weren't any migrants coming. But now they're starting to make money again because the migrants are turning around and going back south. Now, not in such numbers. Many of the migrants made it into the United States and are still there. Many of the migrants that didn't make it into the United States ended up in Mexico and have decided to stay there and try to work and make a living somehow. We talked to some of those when we were there in Tijuana a couple weeks ago. But many of them are starting to say, well, if I can't get into the United States, well, then I'm just going to go back to where I was before I left. And it's not their home country. They're not going back to Venezuela. They're not going back to Guatemala, by and large. Some are, but most aren't. They're not going back to, well, they're not going back to Cuba or Haiti unless they're being forced to by getting flown back there by the United States or something. They're going back to the countries that they were living in before the Biden administration took office. This is what so many people don't get this. All these migrants that were coming that are Cuban, Venezuelan, uh, Haitian. They weren't coming from Cuba, Venezuela, and Haiti to the United States. They were coming from Brazil, Ecuador, Chile, Bolivia, Peru, countries like that, because they had left their home countries in Cuba and Haiti and Venezuela years ago, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, before the Biden administration took office. And they rebuilt their lives, got jobs, and were surviving just fine in Ecuador, Chile, Peru, etc., Colombia. I know many of them personally. I met those migrants. I met those. We've been helping some of those Venezuelan single mothers, as you know, in Colombia for several years. There were a couple times where they called me and they said, my whole neighborhood is emptying out and going to the United States. I should go too. And I said, don't do it. Don't do it. You'll get raped in the jungle. You might get killed. Don't do it. Listen, those single moms, if you take your kid through the Darien Gap, you better never be able to look yourself in a mirror ever again. Because there's no amount of money that's worth dragging your kid through that kind of suffering. And so we said, look, we will help you start a business. We will help you get on your feet. And we'll coach you and support you so that you can survive in Colombia. And then, heaven help us, if Venezuela ever gets better and Maduro se fue, he goes away. If that ever happens, it'll be easy for you to go back home and go back home to your family, go back to Venezuela. If you're going from, if you go all the way up to the United States, there's a good chance you'll never go back to Venezuela. So now a good portion of those people who had been making a living in Brazil or Ecuador, Chile, they're turning around and going from Mexico back to Ecuador or Chile because they can make more money there. They're just economic migrants. They were never asylum seekers. If they were asylum seekers, then the Haitians would have become residents of Guyana, because that's the first place they typically go when they leave Haiti. And Guyana certainly is not persecuting Haitian migrants. The Venezuelans would have become asylum seekers in Colombia. Many of them did. They wouldn't have gone all the way to the United States. The people from Syria and Iran and Afghanistan and all those places, they would have become asylum seekers in the first safe country they got to. That is when you seek asylum. If you move on from there, you're not an asylum seeker anymore. CBN called me and asked if I would, there's a lot of news coming out from Panama right now because the United States made a deal with the Panamanians to deport people out of the United States back to Panama, and Panama would keep them in those camps down in the Darien Gap. The United States will pay for it, pay for the flights, pay to help Panama feed them and everything, but it's a lot cheaper for the United States to house those recalcitrant migrants in Panama than it is for them to be housed in the United States. A lot safer for the United States as well. And so those people, now, I do want to point this out. The Trump administration has been bashing Panama. The Panamanians are terrible, and the Panamanian government's terrible, and they're controlled by China, and blah, 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 all this. Meanwhile, Panama's been going, tell us what you need. We want to help you out. Oh, you got a migrant problem? You want to get rid of some of these people? Great. We got these camps that'll hold 15,000 people down in the Darien. How about we open those camps and you can put your migrants there if they won't go home? So the US said, hey, great idea. And they're sending hundreds of people from the United States now to Panama. Those people then have a choice. You can go back to your home country, or you can go live in the Darien jungle in a camp with no air conditioning for the duration until you change your mind. Fate worse than death, man. It's bad. It's bad. So, because of that, there are some people from recalcitrant countries. Now, recalcitrant countries are countries that won't take their migrants back. So, if the United States calls Iran and says, we have a plane load of migrants, we're sending them back to Iran, Iran says, we won't let you land. We're not going to take them. We don't want them. Why don't they want them? Because they make a lot of money from those migrants when they send money home. Some countries like Guatemala and Nicaragua get up to 40% of their GDP from those remittances that are sent back from Guatemalans and Nicaraguans living in the United States. Haiti is like that too. It's even bigger in Haiti. Probably the majority of the Haitian economy is due to money that gets pumped into Haiti from the United States, from migrants. So those recalcitrant countries like Iran, if we got some Iranian migrants that we pick up and deport out of the US, we can't send them back to Iran. So where do we send them? Well, we're going to send them to Gitmo or to El Salvador or to Panama, just depending on what level of threat they are. And the lowest threat ones come to Panama because they're not being kept in a prison. They're just being kept in a camp out in the jungle. Not fun. There are some Iranian Christian women who are in one of the first groups that got sent by the United States down here. And they don't want to go back to their country in Iran because they could get killed if they get sent back to Iran. But it doesn't really matter because Iran won't take them back anyway. So they're saying, we don't really have a choice. We can't decide to go back to Iran because if we do, we'll lose our lives. And so we're getting presented with the singular choice of living in the Darien Gap for the rest of our lives. And that is pretty horrible. So they're calling on the phone, talking to journalists at the New York Crimes, at the, Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, all the, different left-wing newspapers. And they're crying on the phone, oh, we're being tortured down here. It's terrible. Well, A, you came illegally to the United States. B, you were offered a flight home. C, you don't have a right to be in the United States. That's what they're pushing for. They're trying to put pressure on the Trump administration to let them into the US. There's any number of countries around the world where they could go and have a nice life, but they want to go to the US. We don't have an obligation to let them in. We just don't. So I hate it for them. They obviously they're in a bad situation. If you're an Iranian woman, yeah, you don't want to go back to Iran, but you could go to Armenia right next door. I've met lots of Iranian Christians in Armenia. So the US is not your only option. And right now, Panama is your only option. Unless, until they come up with some better plan. So what we're seeing is that this is the craziest part of this whole story, okay? So if you haven't been listening up till now start listening because this is nuts. What we're seeing here in Panama is the migrants are coming in from Costa Rica. They're going to a place called Cartels, which is in the Gunayala comarca. Gunayala is an indigenous tribe here, and they have like a reservation, so to speak, that's in the north on the Caribbean coast, along the Caribbean coast. And most of the Kuna live on islands that dot the coast all the way down into Colombia. maybe I can put up a map here and show you, see if I can put that map up real quick. Let's see here. Studio. Okay, so we'll go here. I just have to tell it where the map is. Screen capture and Google Maps. There we go. Okay, so how do I, oh, here we go. Okay, so here's the map. Turn studio mode off. Here's Panama. And something that a lot of people don't understand about Panama is that the Panama Canal actually goes pretty much north-south. It doesn't go east-west. See, this is the Panama Canal is right here. And it goes like northwest, southeast, okay? Colombia is down here. This is the border between Colombia and Panama. The Darien jungle encompasses all of this whole region. It's enormous. And the Cunayala starts right up here, right here actually. And I can zoom in a little bit. You can see the boundary line going right there. All along here, this is the Cunayala, all the way down to the Colombian border. And there are a bunch of little islands out here. You can see offshore, and that's where most of these people live. Now, these are beautiful islands. It's they're called the San Blas Islands right there. You see that? San Blas. And if you click on these places, let's see if we can click on a place. Well, I don't want to get off topic. The point is, the migrants are now coming from over here, coming on buses back from Costa Rica. This is the Costa Rican border. They're coming back from Costa Rica, and then this is the one highway that crosses Panama. One of the reasons the traffic is so bad is we only have one road, one major highway. They take buses all the way down here to Panama City, and then they take another, like a mountain taxi out here to Chepo, this town here, which is middle of nowhere, nothing little town. And then they go north from there up here to a place called Cartels. I'll just give you a picture of what that looks like. You know, it's beautiful, very nice area, although it's hot, and I don't like hot, so it's not fun for me. But you see here that, you know, what it looks like out there. It's just Caribbean, right on the Caribbean shore. It's beautiful. It's nice. You can go out there and have a whole island to yourself and just have that white beach all to yourself if you want to, okay? But what these people are doing is they're going to Cartels, and right here, there's a port. And on the port, they have these boats that look like this. They're called lanchas. These lanchas are charging. They're charging like $200 to $300 to carry people from this dock, from that port, the port of Cartels, all the way down the coast of Panama, down to Capargana. The town of Capargana is the first town you come to in Colombia. And it looks like this. It's beautiful. It's actually nice, but it's run by the cartels, owned by them. Okay? And so for $200 to $300, they get to skip walking back through the Darien Gap, and they don't have to endure that kind of suffering again. Now, here's what I don't get. Why didn't they do that on the way up? They were not allowing them to take boats from Capurganá in Colombia up into Panama. I mean, sometimes they could take a boat a little bit. That was one of the things that Mayorkas negotiated, was to get Panama to allow them to bring a boat illegally into Panama and drop them off further into the Darien, so they wouldn't have to go. They wouldn't have to walk so far. That was something that he did. But now they're just taking boats all the way back, and the price, $200 to $300, is a lot. But they were having to pay $200 to $300 in protection racket fees to the cartels when they came up from the south, in order to be guaranteed not to get robbed in the jungle. If you didn't pay the protection fee of $300, they call it the vacuna, the vaccination, then you would 100% get robbed of everything you owned when you got into the jungle. So I just don't, I mean, that's crazy. Now they just take a 7-hour boat ride and they're back in Colombia. It's that easy. I mean, that's obvious. That's not real easy. I mean, that's miserable. 7 hours on that little lancha. Oh, shoot me now. I mean, good grief. They had one of those, that sea this time of year, because it's windy season, the sea gets really rough in the afternoons. And they were just close to the border with Colombia a couple days ago, and one of those boats overturned, capsized, with 22 people in it, and an 8-year-old Venezuelan boy drowned. Very sad. Very sad. So this is what we're seeing now. They're calling it reverse flow. On the way up, the term that the Panamanians used was controlled flow, because they had to coordinate with Costa Rica. Costa Rica would tell them, okay, we have buses ready to take 200 migrants. And Panama would say, okay, the next 200 migrants get on the bus and go up to Costa Rica. That was their controlled flow plan. Now they're calling it reverse flow, as these guys go back. And the smugglers are all just turning their businesses 180 degrees and sending people back the way they came, charging them both directions. Unbelievable. So tomorrow morning, early, I'm going to get up. I'm going to drive my 4x4 down to Cartels, and I'm going to attempt to make it out to Cartels tomorrow and actually go see this firsthand. I'll take the Starlink. I'll try to go live tomorrow morning from there. So if you want to see what it looks like on the ground, I'm going to bring it to you from there if I can make it. And we'll see together what it looks like. And we'll try to talk to some of those migrants and find out what they're doing. The article that I put up over at chuckholton.com interviewed a lady who was going back, and she said, I repent 1,000 times. I repent for ever wanting to go to the United States to make more money, because this has been misery. It's been terrible. That is what the force of will has done to the migration crisis. It has caused these people to rethink their life choices and decide to go somewhere else. They're not going to go back to their home countries. They're going to go to Ecuador, Chile, Peru, Bolivia, whatever, Colombia. They might even go back to Venezuela. Who knows? And that is the force of will that Donald Trump put in motion. So kudos to the president for wanting to do it. But I think it bears repeating. We should not forgive or forget the previous administration. What this shows is that they intended for all of that to happen. All that migration crisis that we've been going through for the last 4 years, it was all 100% contrived, constructed, facilitated by the Biden administration. They wanted it to happen. A lot of people ask why. And the standard answer that a lot of people have been saying is, well, they're importing voters. That's not untrue. As Mark Stein said, this is the government trying to vote itself a new people. But more importantly, it was a way for the Biden administration to artificially inflate the jobs and economic numbers to make it look like the economy was better than it actually was. Because about 70% of the new jobs that they were reporting were being taken by these illegal immigrants coming into the US. So you should be prepared for a couple of years, probably, of maybe an economic downturn as we start to deport these people or cause them to self-deport, because those people, those jobs will go away. It's going to look like unemployment is going up. It's going to look like the total economic activity is going down. Just keep in mind, when you see those numbers and you hear the media banging that drum, that Donald Trump is crushing the economy is going to heck in a handbasket, just remember, remind yourself, it has to be that way if we're going to kick out all these illegals. And the economy never was actually that good to begin with. It wasn't that good. It was just being artificially inflated by 12 to 15 million illegals that had been imported across the border intentionally. And the American citizens who were murdered by illegals, or the terrorists that were brought in under that thing, well, those were just collateral damage, I guess. All right, folks, that's all I've got for today. Thank you for watching. Again, I'll be out in the Darien area in the Cunayala tomorrow, God willing, if everything goes well. So stay tuned for that. And I'll try to bring you some of that. Also be praying for all the travel I've got to do between then and 2 days from then, because I've got to go to DC and then go to Israel. And I will shortly be reporting again from Israel. So stay tuned. We'll see you guys later.